All right, so today I'm going to be showing you 4 different Azure use cases. We'll cover use cases for Azure Active Directory as well as the just kind of generic Azure cloud infrastructure. Each workflow that I'm going to show you today is also going to be kicked off by a Servicenow ticket request, and then we'll fulfill that through our Ayehu NG platform. And just as a brief overview of the 4 workflows I'll show you today, number 1 is going to be adding an Azure Active Directory user to a group. Number 2, Azure RBAC requests. Number 3, deleting resources. And number 4, creating a firewall rule. All right, so we're going to start by going into our ServiceNow catalog, and we're going to create a new incident. So this is going to be the actual event that'll kick off our Ayehu NG workflow. So you can see here, I'm in ServiceNow. I'm going to fill out a short description for the user. So we're going to say something like add user Ayehu to group Ayehu test group. If we go back to Azure, you can see in our users panel, I have a user that's currently named Ayehu Automation. He's got his email listed here, which we're going to use in just a moment here. But you can also see here under groups, he's not currently a part of any groups. And that's what we're going to change when we submit our ServiceNow ticket. All right, so we know that we want to use the email for that user as our username. We need to find a group to add him to. So we'll go back to Azure. We'll go into groups. You can see we have a group called Ayehu test group, and this is the group that we'll be provisioning this user into. Switch back here, paste this into our ticket, and then hit submit. And that's really all there is to it from the submission side. Now that ticket is going to be created. Ayehu will be kicking up on that alert that was created from ServiceNow and doing all the work on the back end. So let's actually go into this ticket now. We can see live updates. We can see that Ayehu has already received the request and updated the work notes. And just like that, we successfully added our Ayehu automation user to the Azure group, which is listed here. So just to prove that to everyone, let's go back to our Ayehu test group and go into members. And you can now see that Ayehu automation is listed as a user. So it's as easy as that. Let's move on to our second example here, which is going to be our RBAC request. I'll switch to the appropriate ServiceNow form, create a new ticket. And now we're going to, with the same user, give them specific RBAC permissions. So we're going to say provision user Ayehu as, let's do reader for the role type as selected here in the form, as reader for SQL Server. And that's a specific resource that'll show you just a moment in our Azure instance. So as before, we went through here and chose the Azure role type as reader. From the dropdown, we're going to choose the same user for our username. That was our Ayehu email address. And resource name, we're actually going to go back into our Azure instance here, go back home, go into our resource group, and you can see we have a test SQL server. I'm going to copy that real quick, but I'm also going to show you in our access control here under roles, readers, we don't have any current users, and that's going to change in just a minute once we submit this ticket. Okay, let's go back here, choose the Ayehu test SQL server as our resource name, and hit submit. And just like our previous ticket, it's going to take a couple of seconds for that alert to be kicked up by Ayehu. If we go back to the ticket here, we can see live updates when it has been kicked off by Ayehu and when it's actually starting to do the work on the back end. You can see Ayehu has received the RBAC request. It's listing our user here and it's listing the resource. And it looks like it was successfully granted. You can see in our note here, Ayehu NG successfully granted reader access for user Azure AD user, Ayehu, our email address, to Azure resource, Ayehu test SQL server. So moving back to our actual resource here, we'll hit refresh on the reader role. And you can see Ayehu admin has been added as a reader for that specific Azure resource. All right, so moving on, we're going to go into our third example, which is deleting a resource. So I'm going to choose that form under ServiceNow. Create a new ticket. add a short description like, let's say delete resource on Azure, something pretty generic. Going back to Azure, you can see we have just a quick little storage account that I provisioned a couple of minutes ago before the demo. And this is what we're actually going to be deleting. So I'm going to go ahead and select this. This is the only field we need to input on our ticket form. So this is our Azure resource name for deletion. We're adding that here, hitting submit. And just like our other tickets, we'll wait for Ayehu to pick up on that and get to work. So let's click into that right now. There's our acknowledgement of the request to delete that resource. Delete me here 66. You can see that this is what we have currently on our Azure server. Let's switch back in a second. You can see that we successfully deleted that resource. So if I go back to this resource, delete me here 66 in the storage account, hit the refresh button. Might just take a moment here for it to be removed. You can see that it was not found and it was successfully deleted. So it does take a little bit of time for it to be completely removed from the Azure side. That's just because of the polling rate. You can see since it's not found, we did successfully delete that resource. And that's also confirmed on our ticket view here. All right, so let's move on to our third example. We're going to show you a firewall rule creation. So let's select that form in Servicenow, create a new ticket, add a short description. So let's say new firewall rule for SQL Server Delta. So we're going to actually use the same SQL Server name that we had in our previous activity. I'll show you that here. It's our test SQL Server. Our firewall rule name, which is of course up to us, we're just going to say Delta. And a start and end IP. And before I do that, I just want to show you what our current firewall rules are set up right now. You can see we don't have anything set up, so let's go ahead and change that. Just do something very simple for demonstration purposes and hit submit. Move back to our ticket in Servicenow. You can see that Ayehu NG has received the request and has successfully created our new firewall rule. You can see that here, Ayehu NG successfully created a new firewall rule for Azure SQL Server Ayehu Test SQL Server. Our rule name is Delta. Our start IP is what we selected, 192.168.1.1, and our end IP is 192.168.1.10. Moving back over to Azure, we can see, if we refresh this, our new rule has been created. That's Delta, right? And you can see that our range is exactly what we typed in our ticket, which is 192.168.1.1, and our end IP is 192.168.1.10. All right, so now that I've given you kind of an idea of what everything looks like on the front end, I want to show you what the actual workflows look like in Ayehu NG and how that actually gets things done. So let's switch over to the Ayehu NG side, and I'll give you a quick tour of what our workflow designer looks like. So this is where all the magic happens on the back end. We have our workflow designer here. It's essentially, we like to call it a flow chart of activities that take place into our workflow. So you can see that each activity is built out of a series, or sorry, each workflow is built out of a series of activities, which are carried out programmatically through this flow here. You can see we have a couple activities up here. We have some conditional logic that flows. And it's basically the activities are built out of simple tasks that you might have to do manually that are able to be automated through our pre-built activities. So on the left-hand side here, you can see we have our activities toolbox, which features a whole bunch of those pre-built activities. As we mentioned earlier, really easy to get up and running with these. All you have to do is select which activity you want, drag and drop it anywhere into the workflow, hit the configure button, add a few fields, and you're good to go. So very easy to get up and running as far as the automation goes. We also have these controls on the bottom left-hand side here. It's a bit more about programmatic controls. So you'll see we have things like if-else branches, while loops, Those of you familiar with programming languages might know those terms, but we want to keep things simple on the Ayehu NG side. We also want to give you a finer degree of control on how you want the workflow to operate. So with that said, let me just get right into the nitty-gritty of what the workflow actually does. Our first activity here is our Servicenow update record. You're going to become pretty familiar with this because most of our workflows have that to start off. But just kind of giving you an idea of what this looks like. We basically are referencing the Servicenow record and updating the work notes with information here. So you remember that first message that we saw in Servicenow with the work notes where Ayehu NG received a request. You can see that here. That's all coded in there. What's also worth mentioning too is we also have our variables that are dynamically referenced. So Azure AD username and Azure AD group name. These are both values that are being passed directly from the Servicenow ticket directly into our Ayehu NG workflow. And then after that, we're actually getting kind of in the actual weeds of adding the user to the group. So you can see that here. This is one of our custom Azure activities. You can see that really easy to get set up, just a couple of fields to fill in here. In this case, we're adding in a group name and user email, which are also being parsed from that Servicenow ticket. We're then going through the flow. And like I mentioned before, we have support for conditional logic. So in this case, we're evaluating the results of this Azure AD add user to group activity. And based on that, we're going down a different path in the workflow. So you can see if there was an issue with the workflow, they would not go down this side. This is the successful one. But if there was an issue, it would go down this right-hand branch. We built out a specific activity to handle any errors. So in this case, we include in the work notes a quick message, and in the state, we also say awaiting problem, just to kind of let people know, hey, there needs to be something done or perhaps escalated to an appropriate party. But looking at the work notes here, you can see we give information that Ayehu NG has encountered an error when attempting to add, and we're including the username and group name here. What's also nice is that we're including the add user to group activity. So what we're doing is we're referencing this activity, add user to group. This is this one right here. And if there's any error messages that result from that activity, so if there was a failure, of course, we're able to see the exact failure notes within the work notes on that Servicenow ticket, which makes troubleshooting a little bit easier. But in our case, we were able to add that user, which is good news. So we would go down this left-hand side. We're getting user information from Azure Active Directory. So we've already added that user to group. It was successful. We're just going in there and grabbing the first name and last name, parsing that information because we want to present it to the user in our work notes. So you'll see here in our final work note, we're referencing name first and name last, which are the credentials for that email address that we added, just so when the user looks at the ticket in ServiceNow, it's a bit more human readable. But that's pretty much it. After that, we resolved the ticket. It was successfully added. We're good to go. And moving on here to our second workflow, which is a RBAC request. I'm going to open this up. This workflow might look a little bit intimidating. I promise you it's just because there's a lot of error handling built in, but it's actually pretty simple once we dig into it. So let's go into it. Number one is the Servicenow update record. So this is very similar to what we saw before, where we have work notes that are updated and acknowledging the request from Servicenow. We're then going into our Azure AD get user info activity to get information about the Azure AD username, that of course, which was passed from the Servicenow ticket. And if there are any issues with that, we can go ahead and create our Servicenow ticket with an update to say there was a problem, just like our previous examples. But since we were successful, we go down this left-hand branch where we're grabbing the principal ID from that Azure AD user info activity. We won't be using that until the very end when we actually create and provision our user. So continuing on here, we're also getting our Azure role type, and we're querying that against our Azure instance to make sure the role type that we typed in our Servicenow ticket, so that was reader, we're making sure that it actually exists in this Azure instance. And if that does, which of course it does in our case, we then use a get cell value to get the role GUID from that specific piece of information. We're then moving right along and getting our resource name. So in our example, that was a SQL server. We're getting our resource ID from that SQL name. And then finally, we are creating that role assignment with all the pieces that we had throughout the workflow. And then resolving as appropriate here, resolving a ticket and giving the user information that we have successfully granted access to that user to that specific piece of information and resource. All right, so moving right along to our delete resource activity workflow. This was actually pretty simple, not a whole lot going on here. I'll just run through it though. We have a quick Servicenow update record like our previous workflows that we saw. We're then making sure that the resource that we're going to delete actually exists. And if it does, we're getting the resource ID on this activity here, and then we're deleting that resource and referencing the resource ID in this Azure delete resource activity. Based on the results of that, we're resolving the ticket. Our final activity here is going to be our create firewall rule. So similar to our other activities and workflows, we go through and update our existing Servicenow record. We're getting information about that Azure SQL Server name. We're making sure that exists. If it does, we're grabbing the resource ID from that resource. And finally, we're creating our SQL Server Firewall rule with the information that was gleaned from the previous activity. So the rule name, start IP, and end IP are being, again, parsed directly from the Servicenow ticket, and the resource ID is being grabbed from the previous activity. One thing to note here of interest is our memory set here. We're actually preparing a paragraph of text to send to the user. It's an easier way to format and display information. So instead of having that all submitted in our Servicenow property, we're creating our own specific custom paragraph, storing that in a variable called report work note. And you'll see here in our last activity here, we're referencing that work note to display that paragraph of text in our final resolve work note. So that's pretty much it. We've seen 4 simple, but I think pretty common use cases that a lot of our Azure customers are telling us are taking up a lot of manual time. With pre-approved workflows like these, those timely requests can be fulfilled in a matter of seconds. That's kind of what we're aiming for here at Ayehu. Of course, please check out our Ayehu GitHub repo to download these custom activities that I've mentioned today, these Azure ones, and hundreds more.